This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on the age of progressivism. The roots of progressivism. A group of journalists began exposing the social and economic problems of the late 1800s and early 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt, the president at the time, called them muckrakers. He meant to do this to denigrate them by claiming that they were always digging in the muck and dirt of society. The irony is that Teddy Roosevelt himself would become one of the chief progressive presidents. The muckrakers promoted the values of efficiency in government and social equality for people. The big muckrakers that I want you to remember are the following. Number one, Ida Tarbell, who criticized the use of monopolies, especially Rockefeller's Standard Oil. In fact, Ida Tarbell's father was put out of business by John Rockefeller, who used a lot of those tactics that we talked about in class, like spies and espionage. Eventually, Ida Tarbell's crusade against Rockefeller's Standard Oil led to a case in front of the Supreme Court that broke apart Rockefeller's company. Lincoln Stevens, who criticized the poor housing conditions in cities. David Graham Phillips, who criticized business for having too much influence over the Senate. Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, which criticized the meatpacking practices of businesses. And Jacob Riis, who wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives, in which he wrote on observations of immigrants, in which he talked about how, while most Americans lived in upscale urban and suburban areas, there was a huge population of immigrants that were suffering in the urban areas. Differing progressive groups. Many people try to put the progressive groups all into one category, but in fact, they were a conglomeration of different groups. There was one group coming out of the middle class that tended to promote the breakup of monopolies in order to increase capitalist efficiency and competition. Socialists, who promoted the exposure of problems like poverty and racism in the urban areas in order to have the government establish programs to solve them. For example, Eugene Debs argued for subsidized housing, labor reform, old age pensions, and the public ownership of municipal services. The opponents to progressivism tended to come from the business community. They argued that the intrusion of government into the economy would eventually hurt the efficiency of capitalism. Local state reforms. Progressivism really started off at the local state level. For example, one of the primary places that it started off with was with the progressive governor of Wisconsin, Robert Lafayette. Local reformers wanted more accountability in government. They tended to pursue the following reforms. First, an initiative process, which would allow common people to make a law which would allow them to bypass the electoral system of the legislature. Referendum. This would allow common people to get rid of a law through the electoral system, bypassing the legislature. And then last up, the recall system, which would allow common people to get rid of a politician that they had voted into office but had found out was corrupt afterwards. This was only done at the state level, and only certain states have these reforms. Other progressive movements. There were a number of progressive movements that were based upon the overall philosophy of progressivism at the time. For example, John Dewey, using the belief in progressivism, science, and democracy, argued that education should have the purpose of training students not just to learn facts and material, but for critical thinking in order to reform and develop democracy. Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis argued that the law should be read loosely in the context of reforming society. Law should not be used as a literal instrument and just applied literally, but rather should be seen in the context of the time as a tool to change society. Social science. During this time, there was a development in the universities of psychology, sociology, economics, and political sciences. The main purposes of these scientific enterprises was to study the problems of society, using a scientific approach with the purpose of eventually fixing the problems through public policy. The darker side of progressivism. Science was often used in progressivism, but oftentimes it was used to categorize individuals within race and class. This led to the eugenics movement, which attempted to define people by biological traits and then limit the number of children that they produced because of the fear that they would produce inferior children. For example, Margaret Sanger started up Planned Parenthood, which provided contraception to people, both for family planning, but even more so to African Americans and immigrants, in order to limit their reproduction in the cities. The social gospel versus the gospel of wealth. The gospel of wealth preached that some rise to the top due to their natural ability to compete. This tended to be favored by the captains of industry like Carnegie and Rockefeller. They even claimed that Jesus was the model of the best businessman in history. On the opposite side was the social gospel, which preached a mixture of socialism and Christianity to solve social inequities. The representatives included Walter Rauschenbusch and Jane Addams. Walter Rauschenbusch was a German Protestant minister who believed that if we combined together the best of socialism and the best of Christianity, we could solve the problems of poverty in the urban centers. Jane Addams had established a group of houses, or settlement houses, called the Hull House. The Hull House would house immigrants and teach them the skills necessary in order to mainstream into society. But Jane Addams also believed, along with Walter Rauschenbusch, in the need for larger reforms, structural reforms, socialist reforms of the government. Progressive presidents. Number 1. Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt, after reading Upton Sinclair's The Jungle on the poor management of food production, became a progressive president. He led the fight on making the Meatpacking Inspection Act to provide more healthy food. He also led a program he called the 3 C's: consumer protections, corporate control, government breakdown of monopolies, and conservation, a protection of the environment for future use. He also passed the first minimum wage. He believed in the Pure Food and Drug Act, which provided information for safety to consumer goods, the Hepburn Act, which set standardized railroad rates for all farmers, and he even mediated on the side of unions. This was the first time that the government stepped in favor of union workers, and this was done at the anthracite coal strike. One thing about Theodore Roosevelt, Roosevelt actually said openly that he hated socialism. So why was he having the government do so many regulations and reforms? Roosevelt would argue he did this in order to break down monopolies and to provide for more efficiency in the competition of capitalism. But why provide all these protections? He would argue that the protections were necessary in order to create faith amongst the public so that they would buy more goods, create more consumerism, and drive up capitalism. When it came to monopolies, Roosevelt wasn't against all monopolies. In fact, Roosevelt claimed that there were good monopolies and bad monopolies. A good monopoly was a company that provided a good or service to people because of good competition. A bad monopoly used unfair business practices in order to gain control of the market. In other words, Theodore Roosevelt saw himself as creating a more efficient market by using some of the tools of government. Transition. Roosevelt chose not to run for a third term and handpicked a successor, William Howard Taft. Taft appeared to raise tariff rates under the Payne-Aldrich Law. Actually, that was not what Taft was intending. Taft had made compromises with people in the Senate to try to lower some tariff rates. But in order to do this, he had to compromise with them and agree to raise other tariff rates. This ended up overall raising the larger tariff rate of the country. This ended up violating one of the biggest principles of progressives, especially Teddy Roosevelt, who believed that tariff rates needed to be lowered in order to increase competition. A second problem was when Taft fired Gifford Pinchot while supporting the building of a dam at the Hetch Hetchy Valley in Yosemite. Gifford Pinchot, who is the Secretary of the Interior, did not want anybody to go into these national parks, but Taft sided with a man named Ballinger, who believed that a small percentage of the national parks could be developed. When Taft fired Gifford Pinchot, he ended up angering Roosevelt. Roosevelt was an ardent conservationist. He believed in protecting the national parks at all costs, and he was a good friend of Gifford Pinchot. The election of 1912. Roosevelt ended up coming back from his retirement. He ran for the nomination of the Republican Party but lost. So he created a third party called the Bull Moose, or Progressive Party. This fractured the Republicans into 2 camps, and it allowed the Democrats to win by a plurality in this next election with Woodrow Wilson. Progressive presidents number 2. Woodrow Wilson believed that all large organizations hurt the character of America. He favored small organizations, hearkening back to the Jeffersonian ideals of a small farmer. Now, obviously in this case, Woodrow Wilson is not appealing for small farming, but what he is claiming is that America would be run best if it was changed from a small farming country into a small business country. So Wilson's overall program was to break down all monopolies, large businesses, banks, governments, and unions. Wilson's actions. Wilson passed the Clayton Antitrust Act that stopped price discrimination and interlocking directorates. This was basically a bookend to the Sherman Antitrust Act that was passed in the late 1800s. The Sherman Antitrust Act was supposed to break down business monopolies, but the Supreme Court actually ended up using it to break down unions. Wilson now passed the Clayton Antitrust Act that followed up on the Sherman Antitrust Act and ended up breaking down unions. Wilson also lowered tariffs under the Underwood Tariff in order to create more competition. And Wilson amended the Constitution with the 16th Amendment, which passed the progressive income tax. The purpose was to stop the concentration of wealth in the wealthiest classes. The Federal Reserve Act. The purpose was to stop the monopoly in banking that had been created by J.P. Morgan. The Federal Reserve largely controls the elastic flow of money into the economy. The Federal Reserve either puts money in or takes it out of the economy in order to control for inflation or deflation.